Another episode for us from the Reeve Stevens team, along with Manny Cotto, who also helped write this one. A few little references here and there, but the thing I really want to talk about, I know this is a strange thing to segue on, is that David Livingston directed this. And you're like, Lord, this is the final episode David Livingston directed. Now, it's not his final entry in the show. That, as with so many other people, will be the final episode, because he has served as a supervising producer on Trek since mid to early 90s at this point. So, it's not his final contribution to Trek, but it is his final directorial debut. And I just wanted to comment on that for a moment. If you've been following the series as I've been going through the Treks, you may or may not remember that Livingston is someone I praise constantly. I love what he does with the camera, and I love how he manages to pull moments out of individuals and characters. He's not the best director in the world, but he might actually be my favorite television director. You know, just if we were to limit the category to that. Amongst Trek directors, I'd say he's probably my absolute favorite. Burton is very good. Dawson is good. Frakes is very good. There's a few others that are pretty high tier there. But I would say that Livingston probably sits on the top for me, personally. Just my own preference on style. I know some people don't like him because he likes to use the camera a lot, which means the camera usually moves a lot. So a lot of scenes have more energy to them than they probably otherwise should, because a scene with just two people talking has the camera rotating around them as they're talking, to use a direct example. But I like him, and I've liked him for a long time. I wanted to mention this, though, as a special kind of just a little, praise for David Livingston moment. Because I looked up the dates. He's been involved in Trek since September. No, actually, that's a lie. But since sometime in 1987. On Encounter at Farpoint. David Livingston actually joined Trek with TNG. Now, he started off kind of low tier, but worked his way up very quickly for having an eye for things, and became a supervising producer within just about a year and a half, I guess, roughly-ish. I'm kind of going off of vague timelines, because it would be when the episode's made, not the episode was launched. We've talked about this problem before. Either way, supervising producer, I should talk about that briefly, is basically the step just below executive producer. The executive producer, you're probably wondering, Laura, hang on. The executive producer is supposed to be the one in charge. Traditionally speaking, the showrunner, or the mainliner, should be the executive producer. That's not always true, and oftentimes they like to take a seat back and let other people run specifics of certain types of aspects of the show. That's where the supervising producers come in. They're the next in command. They're right below them. Below them would be just the regular producers. Now, regular producers usually come in to produce individual episodes or individual seasons or stuff like that, right? So that's the general hierarchy there. And obviously, it's super loose, because some executive producers, oftentimes a show will have more than one executive producer and more than one producer and more than one supervising producer. And who is in charge of what and where is office politics, basically. And so it can kind of get into a mishmash, right? But that's the general gist. He has been one of the main people who has been effectively a showrunner of Trek since early TNG. I say without hesitation, having recently gone through TOS. At this point, the TOS Ruminations are done. I finished it some time ago, almost a half a year ago at this point. But I can say without hesitation that, you remember all that praise I gave to Gene Kuhn? He wasn't singularly responsible for TOS, but he was probably the most responsible for TOS. I say without hesitation that David Livingston is probably most responsible for TNG, DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise. Good and bad. So I wanted to take a moment, recognize the man. He's still alive. I hope he's still alive when this video goes live, because it will be over 2 years from now before this video goes live, and a lot can happen in 2 years. And now I just clench a little bit, because it has happened before where I've made a comment like that, and then a long time passes, and then the video goes live, and someone has actually died in the interim. So I'm really hoping that is not going to be true. Again, that wouldn't even be the third or fourth time. We're up to 5 at this point. But another thing I should mention, just really quick, to get the timelines on. Like I said, he's been involved since Encounter at Farpoint back in 87. But he's been directing since 1991. The first episode he ever directed was In the Mind's Eye, just Mind's Eye, back in TNG Season 4. That's the episode where Geordi gets mind controlled by the Romulans. It's actually a really good episode. But that means he has been with Trek for 18 years and has been directing Trek for 14 years. Think about that for a second. So, salute, Mr. Livingston. I know you will never see this, but you have substantially contributed to something I have loved for most of my life. And you're awesome. So the episode proper. Well, we see immediately the next obvious step. Let's implicate EarthGov. This is actually one of the ways in which you take away power from that neutral state. Remember I had that whole speech last time about how that system works and has worked, historically speaking? This is the easiest way to get rid of that. You implicate the neutral state in being involved and manage to convince one of the powerful states that they are, and poof, that's the end of that. Usually what ends up happening is the neutral state gets eaten because the bigger state has the power, more importantly, they have the casus belli, in order to just come in and take, and that's the end of that. That has happened more than a few times is one of those detriments of being a neutral state. So they need a sensor grid of 128 ships. I'll give you that one episode. It's extremely similar and indeed a deliberate reference to Redemption Part 2, where Picard has his sensor grid of, 12 ships, some absolutely pathetic number. And the fact that the grid made no sense in virtually every way, and I complained about that because it's just a giant logical loophole in the plot, which wouldn't bother me much. I try not to nitpick the tech too much, except when it's actually significantly relevant for the plot, which that sensor grid was. Here it makes more sense. 128 ships are going to be coordinating sensor sweepings in order to magnify and increase their overall scope and reach. So, sensors get less accurate the further out they are, but if everyone's scanning these little dots, then everyone's getting a huge, high definition scan of a fairly large area. And this actually makes a substantially larger amount of sense, especially since the drone ship it can't go to warp, it can't escape in the same general way that the Romulan ships could have just gone around the net, right? So, woo! That's awesome. We do need 128 ships, though. And that's going to be a problem. Meanwhile, Talis is dying because the phase pistol was set to kill. Nobody brings this up, but the reason the phase pistol was set to kill was because Talis had it set to kill. Nobody brings that up. I don't want to rub salt in the wound or anything like that. And Lord knows these people already have plenty of reason to hate and literally kill each other, but she had the pistol set to kill. So yeah, frankly, she should probably be thankful that it didn't disintegrate her, because later phasers would have a disintegrate setting. Anyways, meanwhile, I do question how a shoulder wound could cause her this kind of pain and actual death, but whatever. I mean, even if it punctures a hole straight through, is there an Andorian spleen up here or something? Whatever. So anywho, this then leads to one of the better, more logical scenes of the episode, and I'm definitely going to credit the Reeves Stevens team for this, because they're really good at thinking about the world building of their setting. It's probably their biggest strength, and one of the biggest reasons why I like the Federation the Federation book so much. I mean, I've read a bunch of their stuff, but that's one of the better ones. Anyways, the Romulan senator comes in, and he's like, "Hey, so your program's failed. Now, why does this make so much sense? Why have we never seen these drones before in the time after this? Why have the Romulans never repeated this trick?" Well, because that's not how the Romulans work. The Romulans are all about the politics, constantly fighting against each other and backbiting and plotting and scheming and all that fun stuff. It is a dog-eat-dog political arena. Thus, we know that the reason they'll never use these drones before is because the program is going to be shamed. Because it's going to fail, duh. And as a direct consequence, the Romulan Senate will try to bury it in an attempt to try and discredit their political enemies. Not because it doesn't have any validity, not because it couldn't be used to good effect, and not because the military couldn't try to revitalize it, but purely because one senator, or maybe a group of senators, are trying to damage the career of their opponents. And that's all. This is made very clear when the senator who is currently backing the project comes in and makes it clear that he's willing to torpedo the whole thing just to salvage his career, even though the project is not exactly unsuccessful. This also kind of brings up another little thing, which is also very Romulan. Competing projects. This is something that, well, frankly, is probably modeled off of Nazi Germany, but also came up with the Galactic Empire, which is also modeled after Nazi Germany, because there would be multiple members of the command staff, the research staff, and the military staff who would all be like, this is the project I'm backing to help us, and this is the project I'm backing to help us. And rather than anything that would make any sense or logic, they're all and trying to destroy each other's careers and projects in order to benefit their own. The competing projects idea. I have actually seen a few corporations do this exact same thing. Okay, you, and you, all three of you work on your method to try and fix this particular problem. And then the infighting and the backfighting. And it pretty much never works out. Usually the reason this type of thing is done is in order to maintain the power of those on top of those projects. Because if the underlings are fighting each other, they're not fighting you. So, very, very Romulan. I should probably mention, and this is actually going to come up in the next episode as well, these episodes, honestly, are probably some of the best Romulan stuff we ever get in all of Trek, my opinion. Now, I'm not counting New Trek for the reasons, you know the reasons, right? But, well, we had some good stuff in TNG. We did. And we had some good episodes, 2 really good episodes in TOS, and we did. And they showed up periodically, kind of, in DS9, but they really only had, I would say, the one good episode in DS9. And, well, there was a cool Romulan and Voyager, and there was. That's still only one episode. And you see my point? The Romulans are so intermittent and barely utilized. They're hardly anywhere, and they're hardly anything, despite being the Romulans, one of the big races, and one of the major powers, one of the big 3. But, despite this, we get little tidbits and little snippets, but here we get nice, concentrated, full tilt from the perspective of a commander and a scientist and a senator, actual Romulan screen time, for lack of a better way to put it. And we get tons of little insights into how the Romulans work, with the regards to how the scientist is pushing this little prototype thing, but then the commander, that'll be Valdor, insists that this prototype has to go out early, even though it's not quite ready. But of course, this makes sense for the narrative. This has to be done out of character, because otherwise the Romulans would win. We can't have the Romulans win. We can't have waves and after waves of drone ships fighting the Romulan War, although that was something that was being tossed about. We'll talk about that later. So, there needs to be a reason why they're failing at it. Well, the commander pushes the scientist to get out too early because the commander is trying to push for his job because the senator is breathing down his neck because competing projects. If he doesn't prove the viability of this and now, if he doesn't get results now, then those other projects, which we don't actually hear about, but are implied to exist, they'll get the funding, they'll get the benefit, and they'll get the glory, and the positions, the power, and blah, 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 blah. You get it. So, at every tier here, we see how much their power structure of power struggles is actually making them weaker and limiting their ability to operate as a whole. This is shown in the episode, which is all about 4 races, 3 of whom don't particularly like each other, 2 of whom hate each other, uniting against a common foe. Don't tell me that's on accident. It's a brilliant juxtaposition, or contrast. It's a brilliant contrast, showing the 2 side by side there like that. So, this then leads to Archer being like, humans are different than you because humans put aside their differences to unite against a common threat. Archer, have you studied history? It's happened. I'm not saying it hasn't, but I'm not sure I would call that a human trait. One of the more unfortunately common things is how humans will not put aside differences, even when they're facing a common threat, and how that almost always turns out badly. Again, history. Never mind modern times. So, Tucker and Reed are over there, reverse engineering the ship, trying to figure out what's going on. It is funny. They this is the scene where it really comes in that this project was rushed, scientist to commander to senator, everything I just talked about, because this really is just a ship that has been repurposed to be a drone. rather than just being a drone, which Reed and Tucker would never have been able to infiltrate. It probably wouldn't even have the corridors other than just maintenance access tunnels for, when it pulls into dock, right? There would be no bridge with active controls that actually work. There would be none of that. There would just be the drone ship, right? But anyways. So then we have some interesting cat and mouse going on. It's actually two cat and mouses. One is on the ship. They're physically there, and someone is remotely controlling, and the two are competing in terms of who can affect whom, and both of them are trying to outwit the other. This then is mirrored in the simple effect of them trying to find this ship to begin with, and actually, catch it and destroy it and blah, blah, blah. So, that's interesting. There's this nice scene. Shran has been pretty cool for the most part. And for the first time, finally, here in Season 4, for the first time, Archer is finally being cool back. Archer has been a little bit too yelly with Shran for my take. And I know Shran's not exactly easy to get along with, but Archer has pushed the line multiple times in ways that I don't particularly consider acceptable, as I've pointed out each time it's happened. Here, Archer is openly embracing the idea of an alliance, and, rightly so. Never mind the fact that the Andorans and the humans have actually multiple accounts of being allies already, including in a future that never happened, as I already pointed out as well. Nevertheless, we also have the thing about the Kumari and how it was named for the first ice cutter. It's just a cool little character moment. Shake hands, cool. This then leads to the other shoe to drop, because things are going too well. Naturally, the other shoe is the fact that Talis dies. Shran is... I've seen grief played a lot of different ways by actors over the many, many years I've been analyzing fiction. What Jeffrey Combs does here is interesting, because what he does is he tries to bury his grief with rage. Archer actually shuts him down, not with a word, just with a gesture, just with moving in between him and the doctor. And that simple gesture breaks that rage, smacks it in half, and the moment that rage breaks, you see him start to shake ever so slightly, and then he just crumbles into tears, and sobs and weeps openly, and, this is important, he openly weeps in front of people. Keep in mind the arrogance and pride that Shran in particular, and Andorians in general, have. To be willing to display such a weakness and emotion in front of people really shows how hard this is hitting him. So, interesting choice, either by Livingston, the writers, or, by Combs himself. But it works quite well. This is, of course, the flaw, because now Talis has died at the hands of a Tellarite. And we can argue the specifics. We can. There's certainly a lot to debate here, but the long and the short of it is that Talis has died by being killed by a shot that was deliberately shot at her to hurt her from a Tellarite. As Shran actually points out, the combat, the threats had all ended by the time he decided to grab the gun and shoot back. Frankly, if I was Grawl, that man would be fired. And probably blacklisted. I would never want that man working in the diplomatic corps ever again. For how badly this nearly screwed up everything for 4 separate powers. This nearly started the whirlpool, this one incident. But it hasn't started stirring yet. Shran goes in, I just want to talk. And he starts arguing, and then he catches himself. But I'm not here to talk about that. You need to understand the woman you killed. And he gives what's actually a very powerful eulogy for her. It's very brief, but there's a lot of emotion in how he says it. She could have been anyone and had anyone. She chose service, and she chose me. I'm going to be 100% honest here. I'm not really sure I would be willing to let this go, even though I know in every way intellectually that this alliance is something that needs to happen. If I was Shran, and Talis was, I don't have anyone, Gates McFadden. Sure, why not? And I'm not 100% sure I could let this go. I probably could. I would never be the same from it, and there might be some political pushings later on to have that man stripped of his position and title and rank and everything, and possibly killed. But anyways, but Shran restrains himself quite well. Instead of going all berserky or vigilante-y or anything, he decides to go traditionally. He is going to go with Andorian traditions. He spills the blood on, I think it's Drog or something like that. I forget his name. It's only mentioned like once. On the Tellarites' hands. I think it's Drog. And I'm going to kill you. I challenge you to this duel. This is our tradition. Archer, you're going to allow this, or else we're out. Now, what's interesting about this is Shran, by his actions later, it shows that he fully believes that what's about to happen is that the Andorians and the humans and Vulcans are going to ally into this new force. And the Tellarites are going to be over there. Probably not a part of it. And he's okay with that, because that is still the alliance he wanted with the people he respects, and he feels like this can actually work for the betterment of all of them. This is, the problem is they kind of want the Tellarites on board too. This leaves Archer in a beautiful position. This is wonderfully constructed. If you allow the duel to go forward at all, we already have a problem, because the Tellarites are not going to fight in the duel. So that means that the duel isn't really being honored, which means we lose both of them, because the Tellarites are not cool with us allowing the duel, and the Andorians are not cool with the duel not happening. If we force the duel to happen, the Tellarites are definitely out and definitely going to war. If we force the duel to not happen, the Andorians are out. Probably not war, but it's still pretty bad, and that's probably the end of Andorian relations for at least a generation. If the duel happens and Shran is killed, that's the end of their connection to the Andorian military, who, as we know, is already kind of not super involved with the idea of an alliance to begin with. And they allowed the duel to happen, which means the Tellarites are out. If the duel happens and What's-His-Face is killed, then the Tellarites are definitely out. And, again, that's going to lead to war. So what's the option here? Archer himself lays it out perfectly. He's the only one who is expendable. If Archer participates, the duel happens, but it doesn't infringe upon the Tellarites, and he's not going to kill Shran, so his death is acceptable, because Starfleet, that is to say EarthGov, is the only one of these four nations which is totally cool, well, I mean totally cool, is acceptable of this situation sufficiently and wants this alliance sufficiently to allow one of their captains to die in service of it. When he tells Shran this, Shran's reaction is telling, and the way he says it, "You're my friend." And I actually believe him there. It's interesting because it's been a slow development, to be sure, but the arc that Shran has been on, God, I wish we'd gotten season 5. If nothing else, it would have been great to see more Shran and have him be a more active force, because he's such an awesome frenemy type character and fits so beautifully into that. His arc, and of course, it's Combe, so I gush, but anyways. Point being, he does not want to do this, but he's going to. What I love most about this is this whole setup, Archer being willing to sacrifice himself for the good of this alliance, says everything about Archer, and for once, we're actually using tribalism in our favor. Because Archer is actually being a representative of humanity here, which is going to impress the Tellarites a little bit, but isn't going to impress the hell out of the Andorians. This action, regardless of how the duel goes, has basically solidified the human-Andorian alliance. Bam. Because of that respect, because of that, species perspective thing. Well, he was a human, so this is humans. This is how we perceive humans now. Shran says flat out, when I kill you, I will absolutely continue to support this alliance. And Shran, who is all about service of his duty, even when it disagrees with him, or even when he isn't personally in favor of the idea, even when it's something he regrets, is someone who would absolutely respect what Archer is willing to do here. This has shown up twice. Once in season 3 with the Xindi, and once with regards to the Vulcan-Andorian conflict during the Vulcan arc earlier this very season. This is brilliant. I love this setup, and I love the payoff. Of course, they do find an out, and Archer does manage to outlast and defeat Shran. Very Kirkian. Shunk. But it's okay, because they did actually do their homework and research. And Well, that's certainly a very human trait, isn't it? Odo actually complains about this. If there's one thing that certainly is very human, it is our excessive need for documents and legality. And this is certainly true in real life. Whether it's a necessity or not is something we debate, but it is certainly true regardless. So if anybody's going to be able to look through the rules and find a loophole or a method out that doesn't involve bad for everyone, it's probably going to be humans. So there you go. There's our trait. We're lawyers. Oh, God. No wonder everyone's trying to wipe out humanity. So, meanwhile, sorry for gushing about this. It's a great sequence. Meanwhile, Valdor keeps his word to allow Tucker out because he's about to kill both of them. And then Reed was already ready, planted the bomb. They have no idea how to speak in code because they're stupid. And then, so the ship is heavily damaged. I love the camera work in this episode. I really do. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. I feel like I've talked about the majority of what I wanted to talk about here, because most of it was about that dilemma. This is a very good dilemma episode. The style of combat, having two gauntlets that are clacked on, that you're connected to so you can't get so much distance from each other, that's an interesting style. I feel like there's a real-life thing that's based off. I didn't have time to look it up. I apologize. But I feel like that's a thing. I love how that ends. I love how Archer finally invites Shran to the bridge so he can actually see what's going on. The Senator, back on the Romulan side, finally makes a power play. He just shows up and says, "Hey, so how's that fight against the human ship going? I'm here to witness its destruction." And Valdor's like, and just turns to look at his men. And the Senator's like, "Oh, don't worry." This is a power move. This is classic infighting and backbiting, because what's happening here is he is proving to Valdor that Valdor can't operate without his knowing. I'm watching you, and I have spies in your midst. Now I'm here to see if your insistence on pushing is going to succeed, in which case we both benefit, or fail, in which case I'm going to blame you. It is a classic power move. We also see for the first time the real maneuverability of the drone ship as it's just dodging around. It's kind of cool looking. I like it. And I wanted to mention this thing next, even though it's the last thing. We get the final dun-dun-dun of the episode as they take off the helmet, and it's an Andorian, a blind albino Andorian, which is the kind we've never seen before. Interesting. And that will, of course, come up next episode, but the scene before that I wanted to talk about last. In an episode entirely predicated upon people having to duel each other to the death and being angry at each other for revenge and races hating each other and constantly fighting amongst even your own people because of the political infrastructure of your power structure. No, I said that right. It's weirdly, I'm just going to be such a geek here for just a second, because it's weirdly heartwarming to see Archer, T'Pol, Grawl, and Shran all in one room. We see the shot of the different types of ships out there, and we see the four of them standing in that room. That's the four founding members right there of the Federation. What we are seeing is the beginning of the Federation. Oh, the diplomats will have to sign things. The politicians will have to figure out specifics. And the bureaucrats will have to make sure everything's properly checked and rechecked 7,000 times. It will take some time, actually in the years range, for the Federation to be formally ratified and formed. But this is the beginning of the Federation right here. You could argue that. We could trace it back, as with most things. Historically speaking, and this is something that's true for any historian geeks out there, you have to kind of decide a point. Because you could follow the thread back pretty much infinitely. We could say that the moment when the Andorians decided to help the Earthers against the Xindi weapon was when this happened. We could say that the interaction between, in the episode Ceasefire back in Season 2, where the humans stood in between the Andorians and the Vulcans, that could be when it started. We could go back to Pajem itself, when the first interaction between the three happened. We could go back to the Vulcan moment itself, when Vulcans first encountered humans, and so forth and so on. But for me, because again, this is how this works, you just pick a spot. For me, this is the moment when the Federation began. And I know a lot of YouTubers, myself included, have spoken quite a bit of ill about the Federation, but the very idea of different people from different cultures, from different perspectives, from different everythings, forming a more complete whole than they could have been separately, is just kind of heartwarming to me. I don't have a better way to put that. You know? Maybe you don't know. I don't know. Anyways, I do hope, as ever, that you have enjoyed. Looking forward to you making fun of me in the comments. I'll see you next time.